I'm Alex Carter, crime reporter for the Brooklyn Tribune, and on the morning of Friday, February 11th, 2011, I learned that even familiar streets can hide monsters. The day began like any other, gray winter light filtering through my office blinds, the scent of stale coffee lingering in my pen. Then the dispatch call crackled over the scanner. Household disturbance, possible homicide, 104 East 27th Street. Moments later, I stood before a modest brownstone in Crown Heights. Yellow tape flapped in the chill breeze as uniformed officers fanned out across a narrow front yard. Neighbors clustered on the sidewalk, faces pale, hushed voices drifting through the cold air. Rumors swirled. The victim was the stepfather, stabbed with a kitchen knife. The suspect? His own teenage stepson, 22-year-old Max Helman, once a promising artist, now nicknamed the Brooklyn Maniac. I ducked under the tape and slipped past a row of patrol cars. In the foyer, I spotted him, Alexander Kuznetsov's lifeless body slumped against the banister, blood pooling beneath the wound in his chest. The blade lay discarded on a blood-spattered rug. I scribbled notes as a detective knelt nearby, bagging the knife in an evidence pouch. Helman's mother, and stood on the front stoop, trembling in a threadbare robe. Neighbors told me they'd heard shouting at dawn, Max demanding the keys to her Lexus SUV. She refused. He flew into a rage. Witnesses said his fist pummeled the dashboard as he climbed behind the wheel of the family car, engine roaring off before they could stop him. I followed the trail of smashed side mirrors and skid marks that led onto Utica Avenue. At the corner of President Street, a lone wheelchair-bound man lay crumpled near a smashed lamppost. He muttered something incoherent, clutching his side. His walker lay overturned in the gutter. Paramedics hustled him away as I jotted down the make of his dented Buick LeSabre and the direction Helman's Lexus had fled. By mid-morning, traffic cameras captured the stolen SUV barreling north on Eastern Parkway. The license plate, last seen on Max Helman's childhood bike, flickered across the control room monitors. My editor's voice pounded in my headset. Alex, get me everything you've got. Back at headquarters, I pieced together Helman's descent, art school dropout, months of isolation in a cramped studio apartment, a growing list of unpaid rents and chilling internet posts hinting at darker fantasies. He'd once been praised for his charcoal sketches. Now those black and white drawings seemed like premonitions of violence. As dusk fell, a bulletin flashed. The Lexus was spotted at a brownstone on 19th Street, home of his ex-girlfriend, Elena Bolchenko. Officers were converging. My heart pounded. 5 deaths in one day: stepfather, elderly pedestrian, Elena's mother, Elena herself, and who knew how many more before the night ended. I loaded my notepad into my jacket pocket and checked my recorder. Outside, the city hummed obliviously, unaware that a young man in a stolen Lexus was about to turn its streets into a killing field. And somewhere amid the flashing red lights and Bostons of broken glass, I felt the first, unsettling tremor of a story that would haunt Brooklyn for years to come. By early afternoon, the city was on high alert. News helicopters circled over Crown Heights and Utica Avenue. I raced to the scene on 19th Street, where officers had barricaded a modest brownstone under a police tarp. The address belonged to 25-year-old artist Elena Bolchenko, Max Helman's former girlfriend, and, tragically, her elderly mother, Yelena Petrova, awaited that same door. Steel-toed boots crunched gravel as I ducked under the crime scene tape. 2 uniformed officers stood guard outside a shattered window. Broken glass littered the stoop. Fresh blood spattered the red brick facade. Inside, detectives pointed me to a hallway slick with dark crimson. On the parlor floor lay Yelena Petrova, her shawl stained, eyes closed as though in sleep. Nearby, a kitchen knife glinted under the overhead light. She grabbed her handbag and tried to run. An officer whispered. He cornered her here. My pulse thundered. I snapped photos of the knife and the curled hem of Petrova's skirt, evidence that would later be cataloged under Exhibit C-42. I moved past a doorway draped in floral curtains and found myself in Elena's bedroom. The space was scattered with art supplies, canvases leaning against the wall, charcoal smudges on a small wooden table. On the unmade bed lay Elena's body, clutching a sketchbook to her chest, eyes wide in a final, silent scream. Neighbors, still trembling, told me how they watched in horror as Max Helman stormed out less than 30 minutes after he arrived, his coat splattered red. One neighbor, Miss Davis, pressed a trembling hand to her mouth. He looked like someone possessed. I saw him drag her mother's body away and toss her into a car trunk before heading upstairs. She pointed to a second-story window, where a single drop of blood marked the sill. Then he came back downstairs holding that knife in both hands. Her voice cracked. He stabbed her in the doorway. By 2:15 p.m., the Lexus roared off again, headlights burning dusk shadows onto the pavement. I followed behind in my reporter's car, sirens blaring, as dispatch described a hit-and-run on a 68-year-old pedestrian at the intersection of Nostrand Avenue. Paramedics raced the victim to Brookdale University Hospital. He was conscious but in critical condition. Minutes later, a second report crackled over the scanner. Armed assault, suspect matching description, abandoned vehicle at 6th Avenue Station. I skidded to the subway entrance, where stunned commuters pointed me to a pale man clutching his arm. He'd been on the platform when a hooded figure lunged, slashing his forearm with a blade, then vanished into the dark tunnel. I crouched beside him, microphone in hand. His battered jacket bore a fresh gash. He came out of nowhere. The man gasped, voice shaking. I just felt a sharp pain and saw blood. His eyes darted up the stairwell, the same path Max Helman must have taken. As the sun dipped below the skyline, Brooklyn felt fragile, each street corner a potential crime scene. 5 victims in one relentless day, and the maniacal artist remained at large. Back at the Tribune newsroom, I pounded out headlines. Brooklyn maniac strikes again. Victims found on 19th Street, subway platform. The pieces were falling into place, but one question drove me onward. How could a single young man, armed only with knives and fury, shatter so many lives in shrinking hours? Answers would emerge through interviews, surveillance footage, and the dark corridors of Max Helman's past. But for now, the city slumbered uneasy, unaware that its predator was still free. By early evening, the entire borough seemed gripped by panic. The NYPD had issued an all-points bulletin. Suspect: Max Helman, 22, last seen in dark coat, driving stolen Lexus SUV. Armed and extremely dangerous. I pulled on my overcoat and headed to his last known address, an abandoned art studio on Union Street where Helman had sublet a cramped loft. The building loomed like a hulking carcass, boarded-up windows staring blankly down at me. I nudged aside a loose plank and peered inside. Canvas frames lay stacked against the far wall, and smeared charcoal sketches littered the floor, portraits of twisted faces, knotted trees, a figure wielding a knife. My flashlight beam caught footprints in dusty chalk dust. 2 sets, adult and smaller, leading toward a back stairwell. I snapped photos, heart pounding. Here, in this forsaken space, Helman had left a trail. Outside, a neighbor slipped me a folded scrap of paper as she bolted her door. "He sent this to me yesterday," she whispered. Unfolding it, I found a crudely scrawled note. "They never understand. I will show them." No signature, but the jagged letters matched the handwriting in his sensei's records. Meanwhile, the police spiderwebbed roadblocks across Brooklyn, checking every Lexus that fit the description. I caught up with Detective Ramirez, one of the lead investigators, at a checkpoint on Eastern Parkway. He looked exhausted, dark circles beneath his eyes. "We're following every tip," he told me. But Helman's slippery. He knows these streets better than we do. Back at the Tribune newsroom, I began digging into Helman's past. Born in Brighton Beach to Russian émigré parents, he showed early promise in watercolor and ceramics. Schoolmates recalled a quiet, withdrawn kid who retreated into sketchbooks, never quite fitting in. A former classmate told me he drew these violent scenes when he was 15. We thought it was drama, not a prophecy. As midnight approached, pixelated traffic cam footage landed in my inbox. Helman's Lexus inching down Nostrand Avenue, headlights blazing, a shadow crossing the hood at one point, too fast to identify. I published the clip alongside still frames of those chilling sketches. Readers flooded the comments. "I knew something was off about his art," one wrote. Just past midnight, an NYPD sergeant called. "Reporter Carter, we got a hit." Helman's phone pinged near the Brooklyn waterfront, Fulton Ferry area. Adrenaline surged. I grabbed my recorder and camera and raced downtown. Under the skeletal outline of the old ferry terminal, I found officers assembling a perimeter. They trained rifles on a rusted shipping container. A single flashlight beam danced across its corrugated side. Somewhere inside, Max Helman could be hiding. I steadied my breath, raised my camera, and whispered to myself, "This ends tonight." The night air hung heavy as steel-toed boots approached. I pressed record, ready to capture the moment when Brooklyn's maniac would finally be unmasked. I arrived at the Fulton Ferry shipping yard just after midnight, the skeletal outline of the old ferry terminal looming against the East River's dark surface. My hand shook as I raised my camera. Floodlights from NYPD trucks carved bright rectangles into the night, and uniformed officers formed a loose circle around a single rusted shipping container. My badge clipped to my coat let me slip past the yellow tape, crime reporter privileges, but my pulse still thundered in my ears. Inside that circle, the atmosphere crackled with tension. A tactical team ducked behind an armored van, rifles trained on the container's corrugated door. A second squad moved quietly toward the far side, anticipating an entry. Through the night vision scope one cop held, I glimpsed a shadow sliding past a narrow vent. Max Helman, trapped but still dangerous. I ducked behind a stack of wooden pallets and keyed my mic. This is Alex Carter for the Brooklyn Tribune. Live on the scene, an all-out manhunt has cornered Helman inside this container. My voice sounded distant, filtered through the chilly air. A sergeant barked orders, and I could hear Helman's muffled voice from inside, a ragged shout, half crazed, half begging, "Let me out." They never understand. Suddenly, the container door rattled. Flashbangs thudded against the metal wall, sending a thunderous echo through the yard. Officers dove for cover as the first charge detonated, a blinding strobe of white light and choking gas. I closed my eyes, pressed my back against the pallets, waited for the dust to settle, then peered through my camera's viewfinder. The second breach was quieter but more effective. A SWAT officer shoved the door inward, flooding the interior with yellow floodlight. Inside, I saw Helman's thin frame hunched over a coil of rope and an overturned toolbox. He flinched at the glare, raised his hands still streaked with earlier blood, and stumbled backward as more officers poured in. "Drop it," a lieutenant yelled. Helman's eyes darted around, empty of tears, but charged with raw fury and fear. He hesitated, then let his hands fall to his sides. One final cop stomped forward, cuffing him behind his back. The knives he'd carried lay discarded in a dark corner. I switched my recorder on. Max Helman, alias the Brooklyn Maniac, is in custody. No one was injured during the apprehension. The lieutenant glared at me, permission granted, but no closer. I filmed Helman being led out, his coat stained dark, his expression unreadable but oddly calm, lips pressed tight as if sealing away the violence of the day. Outside the container perimeter, I watched as they loaded him into a patrol SUV. He met my eyes for a fraction of a second, unsettlingly direct, as if sizing me up. Then the door slammed, engine roared, and he was gone, whisked away toward the 77th Precinct station house. I exhaled, feeling years of adrenaline drain away. The night air hit me with damp chill, and the weight of what I'd witnessed settled in my chest. 5 lives shattered, a borough terrorized, and now the man who did it all was finally off the streets. I tapped out a quick dispatch on my phone. Helman captured at 1:12 a.m. All charges now to be filed. Report to follow on Metro, City Bike, and Crown Heights editions. My fingers hovered over the send button. Beyond the headlines and live updates, I knew the story still had layers to unpeel: the interrogation, the trial, the question of motive. Tonight's capture was just the turning point, the moment when nightmare met justice under Brooklyn's cold floodlights. The morning after the Fulton Ferry bust, I made my way to the 77th Precinct station house just before first light. As a crime reporter, I've seen the aftermath of violence up close, but watching officers escort Max Helman through those heavy blue doors was different, closer, colder. Inside, the precinct buzzed with activity, evidence lockers clicking shut, detectives huddled over case files, uniformed officers briefing each other on upcoming interviews. Detective Ramirez, still looking bone-tired, spotted me by the wall of mugshots. "Carter," he nodded, sleeve rolled up to show dried blood beneath the tape. "We got everything from the shipping container. Helman's studio, the scrap of paper, the smudged sketches, plus knives, rope, and that tormented journal we found wedged under his mattress." He guided me to a small interview room, walls padded in dull gray. On the table lay several charcoal drawings, gnarled trees twisting around faceless figures, one sketch spelling out, "I must be heard." Ramirez explained how those pages matched the violent impulses captured on camera, how Helman's descent from lonely art student to spree killer had been laid bare long before he struck. "These aren't just drawings," Ramirez said. "They're blueprints of his mind." I scribbled notes as he recounted the 18-hour interrogation marathon. By his own admission, Helman had barely spoken beyond a flat, "I'm sorry," when shown photos of his victims. He couldn't articulate why, Ramirez said. There was no clear motive, no confession of hate or revenge. Just emptiness. Later, I was allowed into the temporary holding cell area, where Helman sat huddled on a bench, wrists still bruised from the cuffs. His dark coat hung open, revealing a stained t-shirt marked by smudged charcoal lines. When my cameraman's light swept across his face, Helman looked up, eyes deep pools of exhaustion, glancing past us as if the world beyond those bars held nothing of interest. I clicked a quick frame, careful not to startle him. Back in the newsroom, I pieced together his background. Born to immigrant parents, orphaned at 16 when his father died in a factory accident, sheaf after sheaf of rejection letters from art schools, eviction notices piled against his bedroom door. Friends remembered a soft-spoken kid whose talent masked a growing isolation. He drifted online into forums that fetishized violence, posting sketches alongside cryptic lines about breaking free. On my desk lay the formal charges: 6 counts of first-degree murder, 3 counts of attempted murder, auto theft, and a litany of assault charges from the pedestrian and subway attacks. Helman faced 200 years behind bars, 2 centuries for a single, terrifying day of brutality. As I filed my report, I reflected on how neatly the headlines would fall into place. Brooklyn maniac pleads not guilty, prosecution cites premeditated artistry and spree killings. But the real story, I knew, was more tangled: an artist's ambition twisted into carnage, a life of loneliness erupting into violence. Tomorrow, the judge would set bail at 0, and Helman would be remanded without release. His trial loomed 6 months away, a legal reckoning that promised to dredge every dark corner of his life into public view. I powered down my laptop and gazed out at Brooklyn's skyline, where morning light crept over the East River. 5 lives lost, a borough rattled, and a city left asking how a quiet artist became its most notorious killer. The headlines would capture the facts, but in the weeks to come, I'd be digging deeper into psychiatric evaluations, into courtroom strategy, into the fragile boundary between genius and madness. Because in stories like this, the truth is never just black and white. It's etched in every line Helman drew, every door he opened, and every life he stole. The trial of Max Helman began in March 2012, nearly 14 months after his capture at the Fulton Ferry shipping yard. As I settled into the front row of the Brooklyn Supreme Court's packed gallery, I felt the same mix of dread and duty that had driven me through every headline-covered moment of this case. Today, the Brooklyn maniac would finally face a jury of his peers. Opening statements, prosecutor Elena Vance rose first, her voice steady and controlled. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," she began, "you will see evidence of a day when art turned to atrocity. You will hear from witnesses who watched Mr. Helman destroy lives, 5 innocent people robbed of their futures. And you will examine the charcoal sketches he left behind, blueprints of his rage. Photographs of the crime scenes, stark images of blood-spattered walls, abandoned bicycles, shattered glass, flashed on the courtroom monitors to solemn gasps from the audience." Defense attorney Robert Klein followed with a softer tone. "This case is about a young man broken by loss and isolation," Klein said, gesturing to a set of psychiatric reports. "Mr. Helman suffered a series of traumatic events: his father's death, repeated rejections, social alienation. We will ask you to consider his mental state on February 11, 2011, and whether he was capable of the premeditation required for first-degree murder." Klein called 2 expert witnesses to describe Helman's depression and possible psychosis, but the prosecution's cross-examination undercut their testimony, emphasizing the meticulous planning evident in Helman's path of destruction. Key testimony and evidence over 2 weeks. The courtroom heard from 8 eyewitnesses: the neighbor who saw Helman shove his stepfather, the elderly pedestrian hit on Nostrand Avenue, and the subway passenger slashed on the platform. Each account stitched together the timeline, from Dawn's first argument in the brownstone foyer to the bleary midnight arrest at the shipping container. Forensic specialist Dr. Carla Gwynn testified about Helman's knives and rope, which matched wounds and ligature marks on all 5 victims. She displayed Helman's studio sketches, twisted trees and knife-wielding silhouettes, alongside his handwritten note, "They never understand. I will show them." The jury watched in silence as a low-resolution surveillance clip rolled. Helman's stolen Lexus barreling past a bus shelter, undeterred by red lights. Closing arguments on the final day, Prosecutor Vance reminded jurors of the victims' faces etched on a memorial board: Uncle Alexander Kuznetsov, the pedestrian Mr. Lemon, Yelena Petrova, Elena Bolchenko, and the subway rider Mr. Rosen. "This defendant chose to wield horror as his canvas," she said. "He planned each attack, gathered his weapons, and executed his spree with a chilling precision. Justice demands you find him guilty on all counts. Defense attorney Klein implored mercy. My client was a lost soul, a young man who snapped under unbearable pressure. His actions were monstrous, yes, but insanity is not the absence of guilt. It is a tragedy of mind. Verdict and sentencing. After 3 days of deliberation, the jury returned to a hushed courtroom. We, the jury, find the defendant guilty on all counts, said the foreperson. A weight lifted in the air, a collective exhale for victims and survivors, yet a grim acknowledgement of irrevocable loss. During sentencing, Judge Harriet Solano spoke directly to Helman. You have inflicted unimaginable pain on 5 innocent people and on this community. Your crimes were deliberate, vicious, and betray any hope of rehabilitation. I hereby sentence you to 200 years in state prison, 1 century for the lives you ended, and another for the endless suffering you caused. The gavel fell like a hammer blow. Epilogue. As I filed my final dispatch, I reflected on how this story moved from brutal headlines to a courtroom's measured cadence, and how the echoes of that February day would never fully fade. In the weeks that followed, memorials sprang up, fresh flowers at the Crown Heights brownstone, a bench erected at the subway station, and photographers capturing the lingering grief in neighborhood faces. Helman's art remained locked away in evidence. His canvas, once a window to creativity, now stood as a record of horror. And I returned to my desk, aware that true crime reporting carries a burden, to honor victims' memories without exploiting their pain. Today, if you stroll past 19th Street or gaze upon the East River's twilight glow, you may not see the tragedy beneath the surface, but in the sketches of a young artist gone mad, and in the lives forever altered by one chilling day. Brooklyn carries a scar we cannot ignore.